My own son stood in a courtroom and asked the judge to take away my independence, my home, and every dollar I had saved in my lifetime. And the most painful part was not the accusation itself. The most painful part was realizing that Daniel truly believed he was doing the right thing. I remember sitting beneath the cold fluorescent lights of that courtroom, my hands folded tightly in my lap so no one would see how badly they were trembling. Across the room stood my son, calm and composed beside his lawyer, speaking about me as if I were a problem that needed to be managed. It felt impossible to reconcile that man with the little boy I once knew, the same boy whose tiny hand clung to my skirt on his first day of school because he was afraid to walk into the classroom alone. Yet there he was, standing confidently before a judge, explaining why his own mother should no longer be trusted to control her own life. And somewhere in that moment, as I listened to the careful language of legal arguments and concern, I realized something far more frightening than the court case itself. Somewhere along the way, my own child had started to believe I was no longer capable of taking care of myself. My name is Alina Hayes. I'm 72 years old, and until recently my life was quiet in the way many lives become quiet after enough years have passed. I lived alone in the small brick house my husband and I bought decades ago, a place filled with familiar creaks and memories that lingered in the walls. My days were simple. I watered my garden in the mornings, reread old novels that felt like old friends, and called my sister every Sunday evening without fail. After my husband passed away 8 years ago, that quiet routine became my comfort. It wasn't exciting, but it was steady, and at my age, steadiness feels like a blessing. What I didn't realize at the time was that the life I believed was peaceful was already beginning to shift beneath my feet. The morning everything started seemed perfectly ordinary. It was late March, the kind of cool morning when the air still carries a little bite from winter. I was standing in my kitchen preparing tea, watching pale sunlight blur gently against the window glass. The refrigerator hummed softly and the kettle warmed on the stove while I reached for my favorite chipped mug, the one with faded blue flowers around the rim. My hands shook a little as I poured the hot water, but that didn't concern me. At 72, small tremors feel as normal as stiff knees or misplacing your reading glasses. Then the phone rang. The sound cut sharply through the quiet house. I glanced at the screen and saw a number I didn't recognize. Usually I ignore unfamiliar numbers, assuming they belong to telemarketers or automated calls, but something about this one made me hesitate. I stood there for a moment, staring at the phone while the kettle hissed softly behind me. I can't explain it clearly, but sometimes a mother senses when something isn't right long before she understands why. So I answered, "Hello." For a second there was only silence, the faint sound of breathing on the other end of the line. Then a voice spoke, and the moment I heard it, a strange coldness settled in my chest. "Mom, we need to talk." It was Daniel. I hadn't heard his voice properly in weeks. Our recent conversations had been brief and polite, the kind people have when they're trying not to disturb something fragile between them. But this time his voice sounded different, tighter, careful. Almost rehearsed, like someone repeating words they had practiced many times before saying them out loud. I leaned against the kitchen counter, suddenly aware of how still the house felt around me. "Daniel," I said slowly, "is everything all right?" There was a pause long enough for my stomach to tighten. Then he said something that didn't belong in a conversation between a mother and her son. "Mom, I spoke to a lawyer." For a moment, I honestly thought I must have misunderstood him. The word felt strangely out of place, like hearing thunder during a perfectly clear afternoon. "A lawyer," I repeated, forcing a small laugh that sounded hollow even to my own ears. "Daniel, what would you need a lawyer for?" Another pause followed. I could hear faint traffic somewhere behind him, the distant sound of a car passing. And then he said the sentence that changed everything. It struck the kitchen floor with a sharp crack and shattered into several pieces as hot tea spread slowly across the tiles. The smell of chamomile filled the air, but I barely noticed it. Because in that moment, something colder spread through my chest. My son wasn't calling to check on me. He was calling to tell me he believed I could no longer take care of my own life. I gripped the edge of the counter, trying to steady my breathing. "Daniel, what are you talking about?" His voice stayed calm, almost too calm. "I'm worried about you, Mom. There have been concerns." "Concerns?" I repeated. "Yes," he said carefully, "about your memory, about the way you've been handling things lately." I remember staring down at the broken pieces of the mug while he spoke, feeling as though the kitchen around me had quietly shifted out of place. Memory problems, handling things poorly, none of it made sense. My life had been predictable for years. I paid every bill on time, kept careful notes for my accounts, and aside from occasionally forgetting where I left my glasses, my mind worked perfectly well. But Daniel continued speaking in that same careful tone. He told me he had already scheduled a meeting with an attorney. He said it might be safer if someone helped oversee my finances for a while. He used gentle words like protection and responsibility, words that sounded reasonable on the surface but carried a meaning that made my heart pound harder with every second. By the time the conversation ended, my hands were shaking so badly I had to sit down at the kitchen table. I told myself it must be a misunderstanding. Surely my own son wouldn't actually try to take control of my life. Surely someone had simply filled his head with unnecessary worries. But 3 weeks later, I walked into a courtroom and saw Daniel standing beside a lawyer who was asking a judge to place me under legal guardianship. And that was when I realized something I had refused to see before. My son truly believed I could no longer be trusted to manage my own life. What Daniel didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that the story he had been told about me wasn't the whole truth. Because years earlier, long before that phone call, I had made a decision that quietly changed the course of both our lives. At the time, I believed I was protecting my family. I never imagined that one day that same decision would convince my own son that I had lost my mind. And the most painful part of all was realizing that
I'll
the
call you
betrayal
back.
rarely
Oh,
begins
hello.
with anger. Most of the time, it begins quietly, almost
Hi,
politely,
Mom.
disguised as
This is
concern or
Laura.
helpful advice. Looking back now, I realize the first crack between my son and me appeared long before that painful phone call, long before the courtroom, long before Daniel began believing I was somehow losing control of my own life. It began the evening he introduced me to Laura. At the time, Daniel still visited nearly every Sunday, something he had continued faithfully after his father passed away. Those evenings had become the rhythm of my week. He would arrive just before sunset, sometimes carrying a bottle of wine, sometimes a small white bakery box tied with thin string, and we would sit together at the old kitchen table while the smell of dinner filled the house. We talked about simple things, his work, the neighbors, small repairs the house needed. Those dinners meant more to me than I ever admitted out loud, because they reminded me that even though the house had grown quieter over the years, I still had my son close to me. Then one Sunday evening, Daniel arrived with someone standing beside him on the porch. Her name was Laura. When I opened the door, she smiled immediately, confident and warm, the kind of smile people practice in mirrors before important meetings. "Mrs. Hayes," she said brightly, extending her hand, "Daniel has told me so much about you." Her voice was friendly, almost too friendly, the way someone speaks when they are determined to make the perfect first impression. Of course, I welcomed her inside. What mother wouldn't? That night we ate roast chicken and potatoes while Laura talked about her work in financial consulting, explaining complicated things in clear, confident sentences that made her sound knowledgeable and impressive. Daniel watched her with a quiet pride that made me happy for him. After the years he spent worrying about me after his father died, it felt good to see him relaxed again. But sometime during dinner, the conversation shifted in a way that felt slightly uncomfortable. Laura looked around the kitchen slowly, her eyes drifting across the cabinets, the photographs, the old wooden shelves where Daniel's childhood trophies still sat gathering dust. "You've lived here a long time, haven't you?" she asked casually. "Almost 40 years, I replied. She nodded thoughtfully. "It must be worth quite a bit by now," Daniel shrugged. "Property values around here have gone up a lot." At the time, the comment seemed harmless, the kind of observation people make about houses all the time. But a few minutes later, Laura asked another question in that same conversational tone. "So who helps you manage everything now? Bills, investments, things like that?" I told her I handled those things myself. She smiled politely and said that was impressive, then quickly changed the subject. At first, nothing seemed unusual. But over the next few months, Laura began joining Daniel for more of our Sunday dinners, always arriving with flowers or dessert, always asking small, curious questions. Questions about retirement, questions about the house, questions about how I organized my accounts. One afternoon, she arrived early while Daniel was still parking the car. I let her inside and returned to the kitchen to finish preparing dinner. When I came back into the living room a few minutes later, I stopped when I saw her standing beside the coffee table holding a stack of unopened mail. She looked up quickly when she noticed me watching. "Oh," she said with a quick laugh, "I was just trying to figure out which bill belongs to which company." I gently told her I usually sorted those myself. She placed the envelopes down immediately, still smiling, and said it was just an old work habit. The moment passed, but later that evening, she mentioned casually that managing bills could become complicated for people with multiple accounts. Daniel didn't respond right away, but I noticed the way he glanced toward the pile of envelopes on the table. Carefully, thoughtfully, from that evening forward, small conversations began appearing during dinner. "Mom," Daniel asked one night, "have you ever thought about letting someone help you manage your finances?" I laughed softly and reminded him that his father and I had managed everything ourselves for decades. Daniel nodded, but I noticed something new in his expression. When I spoke, he looked briefly toward Laura, and Laura gave a slow, thoughtful nod. That was the first moment I felt something quiet shifting between my son and me, though I could not yet understand how serious that shift would become. The real turning point came nearly a year later, on a rainy evening when Daniel arrived alone, looking more serious than I had ever seen him before, and the first thing he said when I opened the door was something that made my stomach tighten with unease. "Mom," he said carefully, "Laura, the first time someone suggests that your mind might be failing, it doesn't feel like an accusation. It feels more like a small crack opening beneath your feet, not enough to make you fall, but enough to make you question your balance." That rainy evening when Daniel told me Laura believed something was wrong with me, I remember the sound of rain tapping against the windows, while an uncomfortable silence settled in the kitchen. "Wrong with you," Daniel repeated quietly, as if the words themselves made him uneasy. I asked him what exactly that meant, and he hesitated before explaining that Laura believed I had been forgetting things more often than I should. "Everyone forgets things," I reminded him of that, but Daniel used a word that lingered in the air between us. "Patterns." Laura had noticed patterns, he said. Apparently, I had told the same story twice at dinner the week before, and I had forgot to bring a photo album I promised to show her. I sighed and reminded him that his father had told the same fishing story every Christmas for nearly 20 years. Daniel even smiled faintly when I said it, but the smile faded quickly. "Laura just worries," he explained quietly. After that conversation, the atmosphere during our dinners began to change. If I misplaced my glasses, Daniel would look concerned. If I paused while searching for a word, Laura would glance toward him. If I repeated a detail from a story, Laura would gently interrupt. "Actually, Mrs. Hayes, you mentioned that earlier." The corrections were always polite, always calm, but they happened often enough that I started noticing them. One evening, I stepped into the kitchen to bring dessert to the table, and when I returned, I stopped in the hallway when I heard Laura speaking quietly. "I'm telling you, Daniel, something isn't right." His voice sounded uncertain. "She's 72, Laura replied softly. "I know, but what if it gets worse? What if she starts making financial decisions she doesn't understand?" I stood there silently for a moment before entering the room, and when I did, both of them stopped talking immediately. But the moment that hurt the most came several months later during a small family dinner at my sister's house. We were sitting around the table laughing about old childhood stories when Daniel suddenly interrupted the conversation and asked a question that made the entire room fall silent. "Mom, did you take your medication today?" My sister looked confused. I told him I didn't take medication. Daniel blinked in surprise and said Laura told him I did. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Laura had been telling Daniel things about me that were not true, and somehow my son had begun believing them. Later that night, as Daniel drove me home through the quiet, dark streets, I watched the headlights stretching across the road and asked him a question I had been holding back for months. Why did he think I was losing my mind? He didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said something that sounded caring, but felt far more troubling than any accusation. "Mom, I just want to make sure you're safe." By then, the doubt had already begun spreading in his mind, quietly influencing every small moment between us. And soon Laura would discover something that seemed to confirm every suspicion she had been planting in Daniel's head. A detail buried in my financial records, a secret I had never felt the need to explain. Once she showed it to him, my son would begin seeing me in a complete. Secrets rarely disappear completely. They simply wait quietly in the background of our lives until one unexpected moment brings them back into the light. The secret Laura discovered about me had existed for more than a decade. It had never caused a problem before, and I never imagined it would one day become the reason my own son questioned my judgment. The discovery happened on a quiet Tuesday afternoon while I was sitting at the dining table sorting through old paperwork. My phone rang and Daniel's voice sounded different the moment I answered. Not worried, not confused, but strangely cold and controlled. "Mom," he said slowly, "I need to ask you something." I felt a sudden tension in my chest before he even finished the sentence. Why didn't you ever tell me about the second bank account? For a moment, the entire room felt still. I asked where he heard about it. His answer came quickly. Laura found it. Apparently, she had been helping him review financial documents when she noticed several transfers between my main account and another one he had never seen before. A smaller account I had opened many years earlier, an account I had never mentioned to him. Daniel wanted to know why. I told him it wasn't hidden, it was simply private. But he kept asking questions, and with each one his voice grew sharper. Why hadn't I told him about it? Why had money been moved in and out of the account so often? Why had there been deposits he couldn't explain? I tried to explain that the account had been arranged years earlier between his father and me, something we had set up together, but Daniel didn't sound convinced. Finally, I made a mistake that only made things worse. I told him some things were personal. The silence that followed on the phone was long and heavy. When Daniel spoke again, his tone had changed completely. Laura thinks it explains some of the things we've been worried about. I asked him what things. His answer came quietly but firmly: your decision making. At that moment, I understood exactly what had happened. Laura had not simply discovered the account. She had interpreted it as evidence that something was wrong with me, proof that I was confused or secretive or incapable of managing my own finances. And she had convinced Daniel to see it the same way. But what neither of them understood was why that account truly existed, because that money had never been meant for me. It had never even been meant for Daniel. It was meant for someone else entirely. Someone connected to a promise I made long ago, a promise I had kept quietly for years without ever explaining it to my son. And when Daniel eventually learned who that money was really for, he would realize something that would shake everything he believed about me. The only problem was that by the time the truth came out, the damage between us might already be too. Some promises follow you quietly through life like a shadow that never quite leaves your side. You learn to carry them carefully, protecting them even when no one else understands why they matter. The promise connected to that small bank account had lived silently inside my life for more than 15 years, and until Laura discovered it, no one had ever questioned it. But after Daniel's phone call about the account, something subtle began shifting between us. When he arrived for dinner the following Sunday, his hug felt shorter than usual, his arms around me for only a brief moment before he stepped back and looked around the house with a thoughtful expression I had never seen on his face before. Laura arrived a few minutes later carrying a small pastry box tied with ribbon, smiling warmly as if nothing unusual had happened between us. We sat down to dinner together, but the atmosphere felt different now, thinner somehow, like a conversation carefully balancing on the edge of something unsaid. Daniel asked polite questions about my week, but I noticed his eyes drifting occasionally toward the desk where I kept my paperwork, the place where my checkbook and bank statements rested inside the drawer. Laura said very little during the meal, but she watched everything. Every time Daniel asked a question, she listened closely, her expression thoughtful, patient, as if she were quietly measuring something. At one point, I excused myself to bring tea from the kitchen, and when I returned, I slowed my steps as I heard Laura's voice speaking softly across the table. She didn't know I was standing just beyond the doorway. You should really talk to a lawyer, she was saying calmly. Daniel sounded uneasy. That seems extreme. Laura's reply came gently, almost reassuring. Not if something goes wrong later. You need to protect yourself. The words hung in the air in a way that made my chest tighten. Protect yourself. When I stepped into the room, they stopped speaking immediately, and Laura smiled at me in that same polite way she always did, but something about that smile felt different now, more calculated than before. After dinner, Daniel asked if we could talk privately in the living room. The house was quiet except for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. He sat across from me, leaning forward slightly with his hands clasped together. Mom, he began carefully, Laura thinks it might be a good idea if someone helped oversee your finances for a while. I felt a slow heaviness settle in my chest. You mean control them, I said quietly. Daniel shifted in his seat. Just temporarily, until we know everything is stable. I looked at him for a long moment, trying to recognize the boy I had once carried into this very house as a child. I reminded him that I had managed my own life for decades without help, but he seemed distracted by something else. Then he said something that surprised me. The lawyer Laura spoke with mentioned that people in the early stages of dementia sometimes start hiding money. The words landed between us with a quiet but painful weight. For a moment, I couldn't even answer him. The idea that my own son believed I might be secretly hiding money because I was losing my mind felt almost unreal. Finally, I asked him if that was truly what he believed about me. Daniel didn't answer directly. Instead, he asked again about the second bank account. Moms, who is the money really for? For a moment, I considered telling him the truth. My eyes drifted briefly toward the bookshelf where an old photograph sat inside a silver frame, a photograph Daniel had not looked at in years. The picture showed a small child standing beside his father, holding a red toy truck with both hands and smiling shyly at the camera. But before I could speak, I noticed Laura standing quietly in the hallway watching us again, her arms folded gently, her expression calm and patient. Something inside me hesitated. So instead, I simply told Daniel the same thing I had said before. The money was connected to a promise I made many years ago. Daniel's expression hardened slightly. A promise to who? He asked. I didn't answer. And that silence would soon become the most dangerous thing I could have done, because Laura would not wait patiently for the truth to reveal itself. She would decide to uncover it herself. And the moment when a private family conflict turns into a legal battle does not arrive with shouting or anger. It arrives quietly, usually inside a plain folder filled with documents written in careful, impersonal language. The afternoon Daniel brought those papers to my house, I remember noticing the tension in his shoulders the moment he walked through the door. He was holding a thin leather folder in his hands, gripping it more tightly than necessary, as if the object itself made him uncomfortable. We sat together at the dining table where sunlight from the window spilled across the wood surface. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel opened the folder slowly and slid several documents toward me. Mom, he said quietly, I need you to read these. My hands trembled slightly as I pulled the first page closer and began reading the words printed at the top. Even before I finished the paragraph, I recognized what it was. A petition requesting medical evaluation and temporary financial guardianship. For several seconds, I simply stared at the page without speaking. The words felt strangely distant, as if they belonged to someone else's life. Guardianship, evaluation. Legal phrases normally used for strangers, not for someone's own mother. When I finally lifted my eyes toward Daniel, he looked down at the table instead of meeting my gaze. Laura spoke with a lawyer, he said quietly. He explained what steps families usually take when there are concerns about cognitive decline. Cognitive decline. The phrase echoed in my mind with a cold heaviness. I asked Daniel directly if he truly believed I was no longer capable of managing my own life. His answer came slowly, carefully chosen. I just want to make sure nothing bad happens. From the corner of my eye, I noticed Laura standing near the kitchen doorway again. She had arrived earlier than I expected and must have been listening to the conversation for some time. She stepped forward gently and rested her hand on Daniel's shoulder. This is only temporary, she said in a calm, reassuring voice. Once the doctor completes the evaluation, everything will become clear. But the look on her face told a different story. Laura didn't look uncertain. She looked confident, almost as if she already knew what the outcome would be. I turned another page of the document slowly, reading the formal explanation of why this legal request had been filed. The petition mentioned concerns about hidden financial activity, unexplained bank transfers, and possible impaired judgment. My chest tightened when I realized they were referring to the second bank account again. Daniel, I said quietly, did you sign this? He nodded. In that moment, a strange silence filled the room. Outside, somewhere down the street, a car engine started and drove away slowly. I sat there holding the papers while the truth settled heavily inside me. My own son had begun the legal process that could give someone else control over my finances, my property, even decisions about my own life. And yet the most painful part was not the paperwork. It was the realization that Laura had successfully planted enough doubt in his mind to make him believe this was necessary. But what neither of them understood yet was that the money they believed proved I was confused and irresponsible was actually connected to something far more complicated than they imagined. Because that account had never been meant for me. It had never even been meant for Daniel. It belonged to someone else entirely. Someone connected to a story from Daniel's childhood that he had spent years trying to forget. And within a few weeks, that person would unexpectedly walk back into our lives. When that happened, the truth behind that, some truths stay hidden not because we are trying to deceive anyone, but because speaking them out loud would reopen wounds that never fully healed. The evening after Daniel placed those legal papers on my dining table, the house felt different, heavier somehow, as if the walls themselves understood that something fragile between us had been broken. I sat alone in the living room long after the sun had disappeared, the soft yellow light from the lamp stretching across the quiet room while the silence settled around me. My mind kept replaying Daniel's voice saying those words: cognitive decline, guardianship, legal protection. Hearing my own son speak about me that way felt like standing outside my own life, listening to strangers discuss someone they no longer trusted. Eventually, my eyes drifted toward the bookshelf beside the window. There was a photograph sitting there in a small silver frame, a picture that had remained in the same place for years without anyone really noticing it anymore. Slowly, I stood up and walked over to it, my fingers trembling slightly as I lifted the frame and looked down at the image inside. The picture had been taken during a summer picnic many years ago, back when this house was still filled with the noise of children running through the hallways. In the photograph, Daniel's father stood smiling beside a small boy with messy hair who was gripping a bright red toy truck with both hands. The boy's smile was shy but proud, the way children smile when they believe the whole world belongs to them. The boy's name was Michael. Michael was Daniel's little brother. For a long time after the accident, Daniel refused to say that name out loud. He was only 10 years old when Michael died, old enough to understand loss but too young to know how to carry it. One day, the two of them were arguing over toys in the living room, and a week later, the house felt impossibly quiet without Michael's laughter echoing through the rooms. Children sometimes protect themselves from grief by locking painful memories away, and that is exactly what Daniel did. He stopped talking about his brother completely. The toys disappeared into boxes, the photographs moved quietly onto higher shelves, and over time, Daniel learned to live as if that part of his childhood had never existed. But his father never forgot. Neither did I. It was only a few months after Michael died that my husband insisted we open a separate bank account. At the time, I didn't question him. Grief had changed him in ways that were difficult to understand, and one evening he simply sat beside me at the same kitchen table and told me there was something important we needed to do. He explained that Michael had once made a promise to someone very special to him, a promise he had been too young to keep himself. My husband said that even though our son was gone, the promise should not disappear with him. That was how the account began. Every year we placed a small amount of money into it, sometimes more when we could manage it, always quietly and without discussing it with anyone else. It was never meant to be part of our personal finances. It was never meant for Daniel either. It existed for one simple reason: to honor a promise Michael had made to his best friend. And for many years I protected that promise silently, even after my husband passed away. Daniel never asked about it, and I never forced the conversation. Some memories stay buried simply because everyone involved is afraid of touching them again. But now Laura had discovered that account. And suddenly, a quiet promise made between grieving parents had turned into evidence that I was somehow losing my mind. I placed the photograph back on the shelf and sat down slowly in the living room, realizing something important. The truth Daniel wanted from me was not just about money. It was about a part of his childhood he had spent years trying to erase. And very soon that past would return in a way none of us expected. Because less than 2 weeks later, the doorbell rang on a quiet afternoon, and when I opened the door, I found a young woman standing on my porch holding a small envelope in her hands. The moment she spoke, the past stepped directly back into my life. "Mrs. Hayes," she said, "when the past returns, it rarely announces itself loudly. Sometimes it simply stands quietly at your front door, waiting patiently for you to recognize it." The young woman standing on my porch that afternoon looked nervous but determined, her hands holding a small envelope so tightly that the corners had bent slightly. She could not have been more than 25 years old. Her hair was pulled back neatly, and there was something familiar about the expression in her eyes, a mixture of hesitation and quiet courage that stirred a memory deep in the back of my mind. "Mrs. Hayes," she repeated gently, "I'm Sarah." For a moment, I simply stared at her, trying to place the name. Then the memory arrived all at once. Sarah had been Michael's closest friend when they were children. The two of them were inseparable during those early years, racing bicycles down the sidewalk, drawing pictures together at the kitchen table, arguing about toys, and then laughing again 5 minutes later. Sarah lived only 3 houses away back then, and it was rare to see one child without the other. When Michael died, Sarah's family moved away from the neighborhood not long afterward, and over time life slowly carried everyone in different directions. But now she was standing in front of me again. older, taller, but still carrying that same quiet warmth I remembered from those childhood afternoons. I invited her inside immediately. As she stepped into the living room, her eyes moved slowly around the house, pausing when she noticed Michael's photograph on the shelf. A small, sad smile appeared on her face. "I used to come here all the time," she said softly. We sat together at the dining table, and after a moment, she placed the envelope carefully in front of me. "I found this last year," she explained gently. "My mother kept it in an old box." When I opened the envelope, my hands began trembling almost immediately. Inside was a folded drawing made with bright crayon colors, the kind of picture small children make without worrying about straight lines or neat shapes. The drawing showed two stick figures standing beside a large red truck with oversized wheels. Beneath the picture were uneven letters written in thick blue crayon. "Best friends forever." Michael had written that. For a moment, the room became very quiet. Sarah watched my expression carefully before speaking again. "My mother used to say that Michael's father promised something after the accident," she explained, "but she never told me exactly what it was." I closed my eyes briefly as memories from that painful year returned. My husband sitting at the table late at night, the two of us talking about Sarah and the promise Michael had made to her before everything changed. "He wanted to help you someday," I said quietly. Sarah looked surprised. "Help me?" I nodded slowly. "Michael told his father that when you both grew up, he wanted you to go to college together. After he died, your mother said she didn't think that would ever happen." Sarah lowered her eyes toward the drawing in front of her. "I never knew that," she whispered. But what she didn't know yet was something far more complicated. While she had been searching for answers about a childhood promise, Daniel had already started a legal process claiming I was no longer capable of making responsible decisions. If the court approved that request, the money set aside for that promise would no longer belong to me. It would belong to Daniel. And Daniel didn't even know the promise existed. That was why only a few days later, when courtrooms have a quiet heaviness to them, a feeling that every word spoken inside those walls carries consequences that cannot easily be undone. The morning Daniel and I walked into that courtroom together, I remember noticing the faint smell of polished wood and paper, the soft sound of lawyers organizing their documents while people waited for the hearing to begin. It felt strange standing there knowing that my own son had brought me to this place, believing that a judge needed to decide whether I was still capable of managing my own life. Daniel sat across the room beside Laura and their attorney. He avoided looking directly at me while the lawyer explained the case to the judge, carefully describing concerns about memory problems, hidden financial activity, and questionable decision-making. Hearing those words spoken in a courtroom made the situation feel surreal, as if they were describing a stranger rather than the mother who had raised him. Then the judge turned toward me. "Mrs. Hayes," he said calmly, "the documents mention a secondary bank account that appears to have been hidden from your son. Can you explain its purpose?" The room became completely silent. I slowly reached into my purse and removed the small envelope Sarah had given me. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the crayon drawing and placed it gently on the table in front of the judge. "This is where the story begins," I said quietly. I told the court about Michael, about the accident, about the promise he made to his best friend long before he understood how fragile life could be. As I spoke, Daniel's expression slowly changed, the confusion in his eyes shifting into something deeper as memories he had buried years earlier began returning. Then I explained the account. "My husband and I created that account after Michael died," I said softly. "The money was never meant for us, it was meant for someone else." The judge leaned forward slightly. "Who?" For a moment, I hesitated. Then I turned toward the courtroom doors. "They're standing right there." Every head in the room turned as Sarah stepped forward slowly, holding the same crayon drawing in her hands. Daniel stared at her in stunned silence. For several seconds, he didn't move at all. Then recognition slowly spread across his face as the memory of a little girl riding bicycles beside his younger brother returned to him all at once. "Sarah," he whispered. The room remained completely still as the truth settled around us. The account that Laura had described as suspicious, the money Daniel believed I had hidden out of confusion, had existed for only one reason: to keep a promise made by a child who never had the chance to grow up. And in that moment, my son finally understood the mistake he had made. But the realization that followed next: there are moments in life when the noise finally stops, when accusations, explanations, and fears slowly fade until only the truth remains sitting quietly in the middle of the room. That was how the courtroom felt after Sarah stepped forward, holding the small crayon drawing Michael had made all those years ago. For several seconds, no one spoke. Even the soft rustling of papers seemed to disappear. The judge studied the drawing carefully: the bright red truck, the uneven letters, the two small stick figures standing beside each other, and then he lifted his eyes slowly toward Daniel. I watched my son at that moment and saw something I had not seen since he was a boy: confusion giving way to recognition slowly turning into the painful return of memories he had buried for years. "Mr. Hayes," the judge said calmly, "were you aware of this promise your parents made after your brother's death?" Daniel opened his mouth, but the words did not come immediately. His eyes remained fixed on Sarah, as if he were trying to place her somewhere inside the past he had locked away. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded smaller than usual, the confidence he had carried into the courtroom gone completely. "No, I didn't know." The room felt very quiet after he said that. Sarah stood beside me, holding the drawing carefully, her hands steady even though her eyes carried the emotion of someone who had just learned the meaning of something that had followed her quietly since childhood. The judge turned toward me again, his expression thoughtful. "Mrs. Hayes," he asked gently, "can you confirm that the secondary account was established solely to honor this promise?" I nodded slowly. "My husband believed promises should still matter," I said quietly, "even when the person who made them is no longer here to keep them." Across the room, Laura shifted slightly in her chair. It was the first time since the hearing began that her calm confidence seemed to falter. She leaned toward the attorney beside her and whispered something quickly, but the certainty she had carried earlier was no longer there. For months she had spoken about hidden money, suspicious decisions, declining memory. Now the explanation sitting in front of the court was painfully simple, and it had nothing to do with confusion or irresponsibility. The judge looked through the documents in front of him once more before folding his hands together. "Based on the testimony presented today," he said slowly, "this court does not find sufficient evidence to support the claim that Mrs. Hayes is incapable of managing her own financial affairs. The petition for guardianship is therefore denied." For a moment, the words did not fully settle in my mind. Then I felt the tightness that had been sitting in my chest for weeks begin to loosen quietly. "Denied?" Just like that, the legal shadow hanging over my life disappeared. Daniel remained sitting for several seconds after the decision, staring down at the table, as if the surface of the wood held answers he wished he had understood sooner. Finally, he stood up slowly and walked toward me. The distance between us was only a few steps, yet it felt longer than any distance we had ever faced before. When he stopped in front of me, his eyes were no longer filled with doubt. They were filled with regret. "Mom," he said quietly, "I'm so sorry." The words came out slowly, as if they carried more weight than he had expected. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he looked toward Sarah again, and I could see the memories returning in his expression: summer afternoons, bicycles in the driveway, his little brother laughing beside a girl who had once been part of our lives every single day. "I should have trusted you," he continued softly. "I let someone convince me something was wrong when there wasn't." He did not say Laura's name. But he didn't need to. Because Laura was no longer looking at either of us. She remained seated beside the attorney, her posture stiff, her expression tight with the quiet realization that the careful story she had built over the past year had collapsed in a single afternoon. The judge closed the case file and stood up, signaling the end of the hearing. The quiet sound of chairs moving filled the courtroom as people began gathering their things. Sarah stepped closer to me, still holding the drawing carefully, as a few minutes later we walked outside into the cool afternoon air. The courthouse steps were almost empty now, the tension of the hearing already fading into the background of the day. Daniel stood beside me for a moment without speaking, looking out toward the street where cars moved quietly past. "I spent years trying not to think about Michael," he admitted finally. "I thought forgetting would make it easier." I placed my hand lightly on his arm. Some memories are not meant to disappear, I said quietly. They're meant to remind us of the promises we carry. A few weeks later, the promise was finally fulfilled exactly the way Michael's father had once imagined. The money from that quiet little account helped Sarah begin her studies at a small university not far from here. She plans to become a teacher someday, something she says Michael would have liked very much. Daniel visits her occasionally, sometimes bringing flowers or books the way he used to bring dessert on Sunday evenings. The two of them talk about Michael now in a way that feels different, not with the silence that once surrounded his name, but with the quiet understanding that some people remain part of our lives even after they are gone. As for me, I still live in the same house where my children once ran through the hallways with muddy shoes and loud laughter. The house is quieter now, but sometimes in the evening when the light fades softly through the windows, I sit by the living room lamp and think about how easily doubt can grow between people who love each other, and how much courage it sometimes takes to trust the truth instead. Because the truth is something I have learned after all these years. Children grow older and life pulls them in different directions, and sometimes along the way they forget the small promises that once meant everything to them. But a